interviewing. You know, that's what they doing. Stick around. It's about to get all Ruby up in here. Remote Ruby starts now.
Chris Oliver, happy Thursday. I almost said Wednesday. God.
I thought it was Friday, so
I wish.
We've had a sick kiddo at home, so this week has been just a nightmare. I haven't slept much at all.
Now that I'm looking at you, you do look a little tired.
Jackson was just passed out on the couch, and I think he's going to the doctor for an appointment in like an hour. So he's been sleeping in our bed, just coughing and mucus, and just poor kid. But luckily, we haven't gotten it yet. Well, Brooke may have had it last week, so I don't know. I need a day of sleep.
I feel that. Well, speaking of someone who needs some sleep catch up, we have Marco Roth on the show. Marco, welcome.
Thank you for having me. It's quite surreal to be on the other side of the podcast for once, after listening to it for so many years.
Have we never done this before?
Like, no, but I feel like we've tried to get you on for years, and now it's finally happened.
Well, super happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Well, if you listen to the last episode, listeners, then you'll know that I was super excited by Marco's talk at RailsConf, and you just got back from...
I just got back from San Francisco, where I attended to give a talk at the SF Ruby meetup.
Very cool. I want to talk about Herb, because you gave a talk at RailsConf, and maybe we can talk a little bit about that for the people who haven't seen it yet. But I have been so interested in this problem years ago, and I'm like, oh, finally, someone's working on this. I actually was working on a template file for some infinite pagination, and I saw some HTML errors get like added directly because of some non-enclosed tags I had. I was like, there it is, right there in my ERB file.
Yeah, it's been something that hasn't been really worked on for, I would say, years or even decades at this point. And it just felt like it's the right time now for me to focus on this problem and try to solve it for like once, and then have it in a way that people can just use and enjoy it without having to mess with any setups or any gems or install any specific Ruby versions with Ruby gems that get lost when you upgrade your Ruby version in your app. Just so it's like independent, you just install this thing and it works in your editor or in your CLI or wherever you want to use it.
So you want to tell people what Herb is before we start going deeper into it?
Yeah, sure. Herb is like a combination of HTML ERB. That's where the name comes from. The H from HTML and ERB. For the longest time, I guess in Ruby, ERB has been there in the default library. But ERB just is really concerned about strings. It doesn't really care about any of your HTML in your files. So all it really sees is string and Ruby. And any of your templates that you write in your Rails application or in any other Ruby application that uses ERB doesn't really care about the HTML around these ERB tags. So what Herb is trying to do is it's trying to give that more structure and more sense of what HTML and ERB look like in combination. So it doesn't treat it just as strings, but it tries to make sense of it as HTML. And what this gives us is an ecosystem of tools that allow us to analyze ERB, find errors, find missing tags, but write some more tools around it that help us write these HTML ERB files in our daily workflows.
I always said like I liked Haml and Slim a lot better because one of the main reasons was like I could auto format it. And the type of person that gets bogged down in details like that, I'm like, I just want to run a formatter on this ERB and I don't want to do anything about it. And there have been some attempts over the years, but you're kind of coming at this from a completely new perspective of like, okay, let's take out the HTML and parse that and let's parse the Ruby inside of it. I think I understood your talk correctly.
Yeah, that's right. So the motivation was mostly coming from me working on tools like Stimulus LSP and Turbo LSP. For those tools, I wanted to also support the regular ERB syntax that you were using in your Rails apps. And until today, they don't support any advanced ERB. So it just works on HTML. And this works great, but it doesn't work on any of the ERB. And having kind of experienced that, or trying to make it work in these tools, and then some other combinations of, we are missing a formatter, we are missing a good linter, we are missing any kind of tooling for these files. I just wanted to tackle this problem at kind of the source. And that's why I decided to write a new HTML ERB parser from the ground up, inspired by the Ruby Prism parser, how they kind of have this all kind of worked out, and how it's now powering all these awesome tools, including like Rubocop now, the Ruby LSP, but even like internals inside Ruby that just use the Prism parser now to compile the instructions to run them on the VM. So the idea is just to make it easier for engineers to work with ERB files, but also for tooling developers to make it easier for them to deal with these files and have some introspection in how these files are structured and how they interleave with each other, the HTML and the Ruby.
And one of my favorite things is like, you know, when you make a typo in an ERB file and it's like, hey, something's broken. It could be anywhere in these 300 lines. This is something that can make that actually specific and show you like you probably made a typo here, because it's actually able to parse it and understand it. And actually, because it's Ruby syntax inside of the HTML, fairly complicated, I would assume, which is why it's kind of been kind of terrible being like, yep, there's a missing character somewhere, but good luck finding it.
Yeah, I mean, for Ruby, it has been really great in the error pages or the exception screens in Rails, where it shows you the exact line, the exact character on that line, and where something went wrong or something raised. But yeah, as you said, with ERB, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. It really depends on what kind of error you have or what kind of typo you have in the file. And depending on that, it might show you some context, but most of the times it doesn't show you anything at all. And that's definitely something I personally want to improve going forward now that we have the tools and can analyze these files to show you here's actually where it went wrong and that's what is wrong. And so it's more actionable for you to see what is happening in the error.
Those specific things of, I don't know, you missed a end tag or something, and it's like, we have no idea where that was supposed to end, and here's the rest of the contents of the file. It's like, okay, thanks, but that's not particularly useful. Hard to debug those things.
Yeah, so it's kind of hard for you to figure out what's wrong with it because it doesn't give you any formatting or any syntax highlighting or indentation on this error message. So you just get this one blob of code or one blob of text where you don't see what's wrong with it. And that's kind of tricky for you to figure out where it went wrong.
I know like this figuring out the structural problems in your HTML is like a key part of this project, but I only care about formatting because that's who I am. And I really want to know when the formatting is coming to the VS Code extension because I am so ready to like implement that at Podia.
The good news is that it's already there for you today to use if you kind of opt in. The problem why we haven't made it as default today is I'm not super confident that it can actually format or handle all cases. So I'm pretty sure it kind of trips over some situations or it over formats more, like it over aggressively formats your files where it breaks up things where it shouldn't, or it doesn't break up things where it should. So it looks not quite right yet, but that's just that we have to fine tune that and figure out what feels wrong or what feels right in the sense of that's how we as a community want to format our files by default. That's not something that's been talked about a lot, I think. For Rubocop or for like standards, there are Ruby style guides that say this is how you write idiomatic Ruby and that's how you should be writing your Ruby. But there hasn't been anything like that I at least am aware of, where it says, here's how you write good view files, here's how you kind of format them, here's what you should be using, here's where you should use helpers, here's where you should use this or that. There's not really any guidance on that. And that's kind of why I think it's important for us as a community to figure out what good view files look like, and then having a linter and a formatter enforcing these good practices in your editor, but also as part of a CLI or as a linter and a formatter. So that's kind of the whole idea now that we have this foundation, this parser, which allows us to understand these files very much detail, that we can now go and build these awesome tools on top of it, which makes it a lot easier because we can just auto format or lint these files.
Honeybadger helps you deploy with confidence and be your team's DevOps hero by combining error, uptime, and performance monitoring in one simple platform. It's free to get started, and setup just takes a few minutes. Be the hero your team needs. Suit up at honeybadger.io. That's www.honeybadger.io. I was going to ask, have you used the ERB lint from Shopify at all?
Yeah, I have been using that in pretty much every project. They have some good rules, but I also felt like they're quite, I don't know what to say, don't feel super in depth for what we could be doing. We could be doing so much more and catch so many more things. And I think part of this is also the way they built it, or the way they couldn't build it because they didn't have the right tools to analyze ERB files. Most of the ERB parsers before that kind of handled HTML as well were using some kind of hack to make it work, but they didn't really have any good understanding of what's actually happening and how it's happening. So that's kind of where Herb is different, where it tries to really understand HTML as a thing and the Ruby as a thing, and then putting this together in one syntax tree for you to kind of walk or visit and look at. And one of the best examples that I kind of have been showing to kind of illustrate that is if you have a if condition or an if tag where you check something and you have this if tag, which is in the ERB opening and closing tag. So it's like, wait, is it less than or greater than?
Do you mean like an if at the end of a condition? I'll do that a lot. I'll do like render blah, blah, blah component. And at the end of that, I'll be like if condition.
Yeah, so I think the best way to illustrate why this is different or how this is different is if you have a if ERB tag. The opening ERB tag, you have an if and a condition, and you close it. Then you have some content in between, and at the end, you have a end tag, which is also wrapped in the ERB tag as well. And most parsers would understand that they are Ruby parts and these are HTML parts or string parts, but none of these parsers would know that these two individual ERB tags belong together. So the if tag is opening that whole statement and the end is closing it, and everything in between should be considered a child of that statement. But none of these parsers would understand that these two tags belong together. And that's how Herb is different in the way it's treating and parsing these statements.
Yeah, I thought the graphics that you used at RailsConf to like show that were really good. So once again, everyone go watch this talk. But it made a lot more sense. It was like, okay, well, these conditions belong together. Let's pull them out. Like when we view it with Prism, we can see these belong together. But previously, a lot of these tools are just scanning and looking for text, basically.
Yeah, most of these tools were using like string matching to figure out what kind of content there is. But since Herb is using Prism under the hood to actually parse the Ruby in these ERB tags, we can understand what's going on, and we can understand if it's complete or if it's missing something or if we need an end to close this previous statement. And that's the way we can match and now put this this richer syntax tree together, which is more valuable for building tools like a formatter, because it knows what belongs together and how you want to format it as a result.
Is there a world in which I could use Herb to like format my ERB, but use standard to format the Ruby code inside of it? Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. So Herb has a mode for extracting Ruby, just a pure Ruby out of your ERB template. So what it gives you is just a Ruby string, just with everything else removed. So you could totally run this over standard, or we could do this for you in a plugin or something. But I've been thinking about this a lot, and how can we use the existing linter ecosystem like Rubicop and standard to run it over the view files. And I think there are some rules where this makes sense, but also it's quite a different context in which you are writing the Ruby. So some rules that might make sense in your actual models or classes don't really make sense for you to enforce in view files. And that's why I think we should have a limited set of specific linter rules for the Ruby in view files, and then maybe look at existing rules that we can kind of plug in and run on the ERB files too. But I think that's something that we have to figure out once we have the foundation kind of laid out to when it's kind of working already. to then look at existing rules that we can just borrow and kind of run over the extracted Ruby as well.
I have this formatting thing that I run into a lot. It weighs on my mind a lot more heavily than I'm willing to admit. So we use Vue component. And so I am often making a lot of render my component.new and then passing in a bunch of args. And when the line is too long, I want that to be multi-line. And there is no consensus in our code base, in the Ruby community at all, on what that indentation looks like for that ERP. And it drives me nuts because sometimes I'll put render, I'll wrap everything in parentheses. I'll put render on the first line. Second line will have my component indented in. Third line, the arguments indented in. It just looks weird and funky. And I just need consensus on that because that is my biggest Ruby problem.
Yeah, I think that's quite common for me to even run into myself. And I caught myself formatting in one way and then another day in another way. And the same with HTML tags too. It's like if you have a bunch of tailwind classes or if you have a bunch of attributes on your HTML tags, there's really no good way to enforce one consistent style. And that's definitely a goal of this project, to make it consistent and land on something that makes sense either for your team or for us as a community. And you can either go crazy and configure it the way you like it, or ideally we just have a set of default rules that is just standard where you aren't able to customize it heavily. But I think I want to provide both, just so we have the full power of a linter, and then have maybe a preset, which is just, this is default community rules, and that's what you should be using ideally. And then maybe you can customize it to your liking.
That makes sense. Standard has a thing called lint roller, I believe that's the right thing. We'll put a link to it in the show notes. And it's basically like a way to like extend like standard to add in like your own custom stuff. So I saw it used recently for implementing Rubicop RSpec into standard through this lint roller configuration thing. It's pretty cool. But okay, enough about formatting because I could talk about that all day. You have like this really massive idea or plan or vision for like where this project could lead to. And I wanted to talk about that a bit.
Yeah. So right now, everything we've been talking about and everything that's going to be releasing the next few weeks is about tooling. So this is more to help you write more consistent views, help you catch errors early on in your kind of shortened feedback loop, and just give you more introspection of what's happening or might be going wrong in the application. But the more kind of was working on this, the more I realized that we could go and take this a step further even. And that includes just actually rendering ERB or rendering out a ERB template to a string. And that's where this whole idea of reaction view came into place. So the idea here is that we can build a more advanced ERB compiler or ERB renderer that uses Herb under the hood to figure out what it should be rendered and what it should be rendering. And there are multiple I was talking about this in my talk about levels of adoption of how far we can kind of go with this. And in the kind of initial levels, you would just be adding more introspection, giving you more feedback, giving you a way of opting into a stricter set of rules. So if you don't close your tags the right way, your HTML tags the right way, it wouldn't actually let you render this template. So it wouldn't be able to render invalid HTML from the engine point of view, which is kind of really what's been missing too, I think, in regular ERB. Since it's just strings that are being concatenated together into one big string, it doesn't have an understanding of HTML as we were talking about earlier. So the idea here is that if you just say, if you have a missing closing tag, we won't let you compile this template, which means you cannot render it as a result, unless you go and fix all your errors. And that's something that's really looked as undefined behavior in the browser. It might be able to fix it for you, to auto-fix it for you, based on it opening another tag or it closing another tag, or based on the context, it might be able to figure it out. But sometimes it's just intransparent what's happening, and you might be lucky that it's just worked the way it worked. But ideally, you want to ship valid HTML to the browser, so there's no room for interpretation to how the browser handles it. And that's the thing that we want to kind of focus on now too, to make sure that you ship safe HTML, that you ship valid HTML, that you ship accessible HTML, and having all of that enforced in the core of the engine itself, so you are not able to produce bad HTML.
Yeah, the accessibility piece is interesting by itself, because when you were talking about this on stage and you were going through all this stuff, I was like, oh my God, this could help me with this and this and that. And then I didn't even think about accessibility until you brought it up. And I was like, wow, that could be really helpful if you were able to like implement a set of accessibility rules for either your team or just standard throughout the community, and just naturally help improve the quality of your code we ship just right there.
So the problem is with static analysis is that you can only go so far without actually running the codes. So you can catch some of these errors early on in a static analysis time or at static analysis time, but there are some things you cannot really figure out at that point. But when you are in control of also rendering these templates, you actually are running the codes and you can see how the template is going to be rendered out or what it was rendered as. So you can run these checks as part of like a post hook to rendering the actual templates to see if whatever you just produced is actually valid or makes sense in terms of accessibility, but also in terms of safety or even completeness of HTML.
What happens when a developer decides to record his own podcast ad? Let's find out. I'm Adam from JudoScale, and at JudoScale, there's no marketing team, no salespeople, and no customer support. I mean, we do have customer support, but it's just us, the developers. That's why our support is top notch. Anyway, we're JudoScale. We're the autoscaler that actually works. We do it better than anyone else by tracking the right metrics and checking those metrics more frequently. And we wrap it all in a beautiful UI with powerful and intuitive controls. We work with hosting platforms like Heroku, Render, and Amazon ECS to gracefully handle your traffic spikes and backed up job queues. If you want that peace of mind and a much lower hosting bill, you should check us out. Visit judoscale.com/remote Ruby for your special gift as a remote Ruby listener. That's judoscale.com/remote Ruby.
You had this idea for like live templates, adopting kind of from something that Phoenix does. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So as I was saying, this is like the first levels is more about improving how we are doing ERB today in your regular apps already. But then also, if we are having such a big introspection into these view files, we might be able to do more than just doing analysis, but also helping to render out specific pieces of a HTML template. And what I mean by that is that we can maybe look at tracing variables or tracing Ruby code in your ERB templates and looking at what changes in between render calls, and then only being able to re-render certain pieces that change between render calls. So you can kind of think of this as React has this. So React has this concept of a state. And whenever you update the state of that component, it will reflect that by just applying or re-rendering the piece that changed. And React itself really understands well what is changing or what is dependent on what, depending on which state. And it just is able to reflect these state changes and update just the piece that actually changed. And that's the idea here too. So if you say we have a certain state in our view files and it changes between render calls, we can also trace and only render pieces that actually changed. That's something that's quite ambitious, and I'm not really sure at this point if it's really feasible and if it really makes sense. But from a conceptual level, I think it is possible and we could do something like that. What I'm not really sure about is how we would kind of track the state, how we kind of persist the state, how we know that something changed. And if something changed, how we kind of communicate this back to the client. That's all kind of open points at this point still. But one kind of interesting use case I was thinking about this, even if it's not really feasible for production, is a local dev server. So when you are kind of working on the templates and you are saving them, we can kind of diff the before and after the save, what changed between these files when you were working on them. And this might even be able to allow us to implement some kind of hot reloading right in your local environment. So you don't have to do full page refreshes, but you might be able to just do incremental updates as you are working on these files. That's something where I can see an engine like this even useful, even if it's not in production, for reactive re-rendering these templates. But that's something that could power a local dev server that really improves the quality of life by just being able to refresh the page without having to do the whole thing. There's something similar to like Hotwire Spark, if you have been dabbling with that. It works fairly well, but I also run into issues where it's trying to reload too much, or where it's trying to aggressively reload a part of the page. And given the way it's kind of working right now, that makes sense. But I think even there, we can kind of improve and rely on the power of Herb now to be able to detect what's changing and then being able to smartly apply these changes to the client.
That's really cool. I feel like I've seen so many different hacks and ways that people have implemented, like make my view refresh when I edit this template. There's gems, there's services. I've seen it all. I think I tried Hotwire Spark and it didn't work. That was a while ago though. And I don't remember what the issue was. So maybe I'll have to try that again.
Yeah, I think it improved quite a bit in the last half a year or so. They have been working on it and it works great for, as I said, simple use cases. But it's mostly doing too much and refreshing too aggressively, which is quite heavy even for reloading pages. If it takes like 4 seconds to reload a page, then you have a bad experience re-rendering the whole page again. But
yeah,
it's maybe a sign of your view code is bad or your kind of architecture is bad. So it's not necessarily to blame on Spark at this point. Yeah.
Right. It's just all my N+1s it's got to spit through.
The power of having this reload engine, like this dev server built in from an engine point of view, is that we understand how we are rendering the ERB templates, and we know all of that kind of well because we are the ones working on it. So this kind of gives us this whole experience that comes out of one box. So I think we can really improve the whole story from writing views, rendering views, working on views, refreshing views. It's just this whole flow that now is kind of owned or powered by Herb. And that's kind of where I see the power in this whole ecosystem of tools that just work seamlessly with each other.
I was like thinking in my mind, I was like, dude, when I first met Marco and we were working on Stimulus Reflex, I had no idea we'd get here where you've done such cool stuff. The LSPs, the Turbo LSP, and now this. How do you do it all?
Well, the thing is that most of this work is kind of coming from that initially. So my starting point was Stimulus Reflex and later Cable Ready that I was kind of working on heavily. And some of these ideas here are still kind of inspired by those tools. And while kind of Stimulus Reflex is kind of phasing out in favor of Hotwire nowadays, there's still a lot of things left to be desired in Hotwire. And I think some of these tools still don't replace what Stimulus Reflex gave us back in the day. And I feel like Reaction View could revive some of these ideas and bring them back into a modern workflow with Hotwire, how you are doing that. And that's the thing, like having worked on Stimulus as well, and a lot of Turbo and the LSPs, and now Herb gives me kind of the back or insider knowledge of how to piece it all together now to make this one more thing for the whole view layer for Rails in the future. Yeah.
Yeah. I remember Nate coining this term back when we were just first pairing on Stimulus Reflex called reactive Rails. And you're taking that to like an even more extreme, which is super cool.
Yeah. And as I said earlier, I'm not sure if it really is feasible to kind of do all of this.
Right.
At this point, it's just exploration to see what is possible. What could we be doing and how could we improve the state of views in Rails nowadays without having to abandon ERB altogether and just kind of do an API and React or Vue or whatever else you have. Just kind of to keep it Railsy, trying to keep it ERB and the stuff you know and have been using for the last 20 years now at this point in Rails. Just to make it feel familiar to Rails engineers while having all the goodness and tooling and the modern stuff from React too that we can bring back into the Rails ecosystem that way.
So if I'm listening to this and I'm like, okay, this sounds really cool. How do people get started with Herb?
The simplest way to get started is to install the extension, probably in VS Code. If you're using VS Code, it's the most easy to, or most straightforward to get started with. If you search for Herb LSP in the VS Code extension store, you can install it with one click, and then that should do it. You should see a side panel which shows you all the files it kind of was parsing and maybe erroring on, which means you might have some errors in your view files. You can see how it sees your files and where it might be tripping over itself. And it's also available for, I think at this point, 7 other editors. So you can just plug it in. And we also have been working on making it work for RubyMine. So a contributor made it work for, I think Simon is his name. He made it work for RubyMine. And we might be able to publish this in the next few weeks to the official store to be able to use it from the IntelliJ IDEs too.
That's super cool. And there's also a CLI as well, right?
Yeah, so there's a CLI. I guess the best way if you want to just run it in CI is if you go to the website, we have a section for all the different tools, including the format and the linter. And there you can see how you can run it locally.
Super cool. Let's talk about the minifier for a minute. You mentioned it on stage and I was looking at it and I was like, does it minify like the code my ERB or does it minify it after? Does that make sense? Does it minify like straight into the file?
I don't think this is something you'd want to run as part of your editor flow or as your CLI. This was mostly kind of a demo to show that we can work with HTML and ERB and maybe try to optimize the white space in your files when we are compiling the templates. So kind of as a pre-step to compiling your view file, we would run it through a minifier to make it as small as possible and then try to run it through the compiler. But I don't think this really makes a big difference. It was mostly just like a demo to show what you could build with these tools now that we have them available.
So I talked to you at RailsConf and I was like, what should I do with Herb? You were like, run Herb analyze on your code base. So I went home and I did that. And I messaged you because I was like, it just got me thinking about like the scope of how difficult this really is because Herb flagged a bunch of files. They're like, hey, you have unclosed body tags. Is that true? And I went to look at it and it was like, well, we're doing something interesting in content for tags. And I was like, okay, it makes perfect sense why Herb didn't think that there was an opening tag or a closing tag because this is done in this content tag and it's yielded out here, but it's actually being set in this other file. And this other file has a warning because it thinks I'm not closing it. And I was like, this is such like a hard problem when you really think about it, because you almost in that moment need to see the rendered view with the content fors being replaced in order to even like begin to start parsing it there.
There are so many kind of edge cases on how it could fail. And yeah, in a way, it's kind of scary to kind of think about all these edge cases because you cannot think about what people are doing in their view files. And people are doing crazy things in their view files, and that's totally expected. But what we can do, at least from a Herb parsing point of view, is just raise these to the user and say, we see you're doing something here which we don't understand. And just raising that as a flag or as an offense in your editor gives you some reflection of what are we doing here? Can we simplify this? Can we simplify this code to make more sense? If we cannot analyze this with a parser, how is another engineer on our team expected to understand this? And I think I kind of came to the conclusion that if the parser cannot parse it, probably somebody else on your team is struggling to understand this code. And that might just be a point where you can say, okay, let's look at this again. Let's try to simplify this. Let's try to make this work. And as a result, you get simpler review code, which is easy to understand for yourself in the future or for other team members.
I mean, that makes sense. Even with my example that I gave you with my content for, I was like, because I had to go figure out first, I was like, why are we doing it like this? And I was like, oh, okay, because then this other place, we call it here and then we render it here. And if there is no content, we just add the string to the file. And I was like, I could surely do this better. But at the same time, I was like, but I don't want to really touch it right now. But if I had more confidence that those changes were valid, maybe I would be more willing to make that change across the code base, you know?
Right. And that's the other thing that I want to kind of empower people with these tools. Give them tools so they are more confident in refactoring view files or being able to rework view files, extract partials, extract components, rename classes, deprecate classes, rename arguments, or rename whatever you might be doing in your editor already with all your LSP integrations. It's just something that we haven't been doing at all in Ruby and in the view files that you have tools to be working with. And this should be the starting point for us to build these tools so you can more confidently refactor and write out these files. And it's just something that I have been just fine with because I never expected there to be such kinds of tools. But now that I'm working on them, I'm like, why don't we have these tools? And I just get inspired to build these tools because I am working with the view files every day. And the more I work with them, the more frustrated I get. So I just went and tried to build this ecosystem of tools to make it easier for myself and hopefully for others too.
Is there anything else we should go over while we're on the subject?
There is, I guess, the final level of, reaction view, which is to integrate external components from libraries like React and Vue or whatever else there is, web components. There is this idea for the final step to be able to also incorporate those and say, I like this set of components from this React library. Why can't I use this in my ERB files? And maybe there's a way of us able to make it work. So we can say, register these components in our context of reaction view. And as a result, you are able to use these JSX components or React components in your ERB file as if it would be JavaScript. Next to your existing ERB, next to your existing HTML, just having it seamlessly integrated into the same workflow. There's a lot of things that we have to do to make this work, and it probably also requires some more sophisticated setups for bundling and making that kind of work. But it's something I want to explore, especially as an alternative to completely replacing your front with React. Just having this middle ground of keeping all your or most of your app in ERB, and maybe where you need it on certain pages, you can say, I want to opt in to use these special components for this page because it's more interactive or more advanced. And just you being able to write components in JSX or in React or use existing components from a third-party library that you can just plug them into your ERB views and they just work.
When I came back from the conference and I was talking to various coworkers about it, that specific portion was always the one that were like, wait, whoa, that would be really cool. It seems like the more I think about it, it's like, wow, that's a really hard problem because of XYZ. But it is a super cool idea to be able to okay, I like this ShadCN component, or I like this Radix component. I can just put it here and I don't have to change the whole page to be React, which then you need the props and then you need the state. And then I just want this component. I just need a dialog menu. I don't want to bring the whole kit and caboodle.
And I guess the reality is more and more people are using React, especially in bigger companies. So if you already have a set of components that are pre-styled and pre-configured and just work, you aren't really able to use them today in your existing Rails app. Unless you say we kind of abandon ERB altogether and say we do a full SPA and that's how it is. But I think it's super radical in a way. So I want to see if it is possible and how it would be possible to make it work and just use them side by side. And again, this is just where I want to go eventually. Maybe not sure if we can make it happen, but that's at least the end goal or the idea where we want to go from here on out.
Yeah, we have React in a very specific part of our application, and we have a bunch of components that we had implemented with Vue component that we had to basically rewrite into React. So now we have, if you're in the Ruby pages, you use the Ruby component, but if you're in this React part of the code base, then you have to use the React version, and we got to keep those in sync. And we don't have a lot of them that are shared, but there's a few, and it's like, okay, well, if this component changes here, then we want to go find the JavaScript one and update that one too. And it's like, ugh.
And that's, I guess, the one kind of nice benefit of that. If you would be saying, let's implement those in our React part of the code base. but then we are able to use them throughout the app in our ERB files, and it just works. There's also the option or the possibility to do it the other way around, where we say we have all these partials or all these view components, and maybe there is a way now for us to transpile them to React components or to web components or something similar. And then you are able to use those on the client to re-render parts of the page or render them entirely from scratch on the clients. So maybe there are possibilities to make it work both ways, where you can use existing ERB views and have them be available as React components, or have React components that are available in your ERB context.
Oh, it is super cool. Is there anything not related to Herb you want to talk about while you're here? Conferences you're doing this year?
This year, I was able to attend a lot of conferences because I had the honor to speak at a bunch of them, including the ones in Brazil for Tropical on Rails, Ruby Kaigi in Japan, which was one of the biggest highlights, I think, so far, which is such a different experience from what you're used to from maybe the US conferences or the European ones. It's very different, but also very cool in a lot of ways. And now there was like RailsConf, but also the local one here in Switzerland, Honeybadger Ruby. It's just that wherever you go and wherever you kind of meet Ruby people, it's always a good time. And that's something I really appreciate, the Ruby community. And it just shows that, yeah, wherever you go, no matter the culture, no matter the backgrounds, these people are always nice. And it's super awesome to come back to those events. And then being able to share some of these things I've been sharing today too, and kind of seeing these reactions in person of how people react to this and come back to you after the talk to give you more idea or more inspiration. It is a really nice way and feedback loop to work on these tools. And in the end, I'm doing this for myself, building the tools for myself, but also I'm happy to share them with the community. And if they find people in the community that I find them helpful, that's even better for me and for us as a community. So I really enjoy doing that. And for the rest of the year, I am doing the Ruby Triathlon in September. So we do the Rails World one in Amsterdam, then the Friendly RB in Bucharest, Romania. And the last one is Uruco in Portugal this year in Viana del Castelo. And it's always such a good time to just travel with Ruby friends now, even to not going back home between the conferences, just traveling across Europe to attend these events. It's always a good time. So I'm looking forward to that. And later this year, I'm also doing San Francisco Ruby Conference in San Francisco, which is a new conference coming up, hosted by Irina, who's doing the SF Ruby meetup every month and has been doing it for the last year. And seeing it grow from hundreds of people joining every month to now this, I think, around 600 people conference in November. It's just so cool to see Ruby back well and alive, especially in the Bay Area where so many startups are still to this day.
I don't know how you do it because it feels like it was last year. It was probably longer than that. You were going through the United States, driving through and you were like, hey, I'm going to be in Phoenix if you want to grab dinner or something. And I was like, why is Marco in Phoenix, Arizona?
Yeah, this was 2022. I did a little detour after RailsConf. I had a kind of vacation time, traveled the US, visit some national parks, and then, ended up in Phoenix on the way back home.
Well, I really appreciate you coming on. I really appreciate you doing this work. Like, this is work that like a lot of us have wanted or needed, and none of us have actually taken the step to start something. So thank you for your work. And dude, you gave a great RailsConf talk. Like, it was so fun to be in that room. So
thank you so much.
Thanks for all your work.
Thank you.
Well, you want to plug anything? Tell people where they can find you online?
Yeah, I think the best way to find me online is on my website. I have all the links there to all the socials and blog posts. So that's marcoroth.dev.
Cool. We'll link that in the show notes. Marco, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you very much for having me.